The writer assumes you know all about demonology. Are all demons unclean spirits? Are all unclean spirits demons? All those things, those are spiritual beings that are malevolent, in my opinion. And since Paul is at Ephesus, which is the center of magic in the ancient world, these people who he's talking to have probably just come out of demonic magic traditions, and Paul's telling them, Jesus is higher than all of them. You've got something more powerful than all the demonic activity and magic activity in the entire world, especially even from ground zero where we are here.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast. If you're new, you didn't notice. If you aren't new, we changed our clothes. Pretty pumped about that. But as always, I'm Keegan Walls. I am the layman of the show, and I am joined here, or I guess I'm joining him, the scholar, the PhD, the doctor, the Mesopotamian wizard, Mark Chavalas.
Thank you. Oh, please. But anyway, I said thank you.
There we go.
So,
well, yeah, we're back, and we're going to do part 2 of demons. And so we looked at Mark 5 last time. We're going to jump right into it this time, and we are going to be looking and unpacking demons throughout the New Testament and looking at different texts and trying to kind of, again, pull back from what we did last time, get a bigger picture on that, and then after this, our next episode, we'll do the same thing and pull back again. So we kind of zoomed in on Mark 5, and now we're zooming out and looking at a bigger picture of demons throughout the New Testament. Mark.
Thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't say something. We certainly don't talk a lot about contemporary events, but this is the week after the terrible assassination of Charlie Kirk, and so I wanted to say a few brief notes on 2 levels about it. First, as a college professor for over 40 years, I loved having people who would come and sort of draw out my students to do critical thinking, because though it was something that was sort of taken and assumed 50-some years ago when I was a fledgling college student at Cal State Northridge, and I noticed that my students, when I first started teaching, were always arguing with me and holding me to the fire. How do you know that's true? Why don't you, why do you say this or why do you say that? And so I knew I had to be on my toes, even if I, at least supposedly knew more than they did. But it gradually changed. And I noticed over a generation or two that students would come up to me and their comment was usually, what do I need to know to get this grade? Where do I get that information? Rather than, why do you think you're correct? And so I rarely would have a student call me out on things. And I remember one time when a student did, it was probably, I think I was talking about John Locke, and so sort of out of my comfort zone. And I said something about John Locke, and a student in the classroom said something very politely, but he disagreed with me. And I looked at the class, and the students all gasped as if I was going to chop his head off. And I said, well, actually, this student is a political science major. He probably knows more about John Locke than I do, so I would probably go with what he said. And I don't know whether there was a crisis of confidence. But in any event, someone like Charlie Kirk coming to he didn't come to my campus, but I wish he would have done that in some respect, because he would come and really, if you think about it, whatever people's political views are, he would come and demand of a student, whoever's talking, to basically think critically about their argument. Have you thought through your argument? A, B, C, D, etc. And was he always perfect about it? No, he's quite human. And so I welcome that. In many respects, he was a modern day Socrates. And of course, Socrates was put to death for pretty much the same reason, by the way. And on a theological level, if you're wondering what God thinks about this, God made us with emotions. And so God grieves like us, except it's infinite. And I don't know what that means for God. If you look at Hosea chapter 11, it talks about God in the middle of his decision to judge the northern kingdom. He stops and says, I'm not going to do it. All my nahams, my emotions are, churning within me in my innards. And how could I do this? And so, of course, it's poetry, but the point was is it's sort of exposing what God really thinks and feels. He has a tremendous compassion for humanity. I don't know why he made us, by the way. But for some reason he did. Why did he pick this type of universe to make and to allow? Somehow he must have thought we were worth it. And so he grieves when there's injustice, when there's tragedy. Um, um, and so I just want to make those comments. And it's a very sorrowful time. And of course in any event. And so that's, now you understand the context, or at least the time that we came out with this. Now, to our discussion about demons, this wasn't my first choice. Even last episode when we started talking about demons, Keegan won a wrestling match, evidently.
It was pretty easy.
Yeah, pretty easy.
I mean, technically, we put it to a vote. This one got a lot of votes. So
yeah, but even to put it to a vote, it had to be there to begin with. And so you kept on talking about demon swine, and I just caved. After a while, it's like, wow, and New Testament. Oh my goodness. And so, but I've actually had a lot of fun preparing for it. And I will get back to you at some point. So I started off last week looking at a particular passage in Mark chapter 5 about the demons and swine. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. And now I'm going to sort of do a reverse of what I often do, is I'm going to start looking at documents to see whether we can find a demonology of the New Testament. Spoiler alert, I don't think we can. We have anecdotal statements here and there because, of course, if your question is, I wonder what the New Testament says about demons, I would say the New Testament writers their answer would be, are you kidding? That's not on my radar to give you a theology of demons. And so we're, again, looking for, intellectual blood to, squeeze out of a turnip, if I can make a terrible mix of metaphors and similes and all that other stuff. But, I'm going to be doing something which I did in the classroom for years and years and years. And I talked about this in one of my really, really early episodes. And so you'd have to go back almost about 25 plus episodes, which I suppose would be taxing. But the fact is that when I wanted to talk about a topic in ancient history, I would basically read documents and then explain them. Kind of like what I did with the Bible, is I read the text and then I try to tell you what I think it is. And so I'm an ancient commentator from that standpoint, or maybe a commentator who's ancient is maybe a better way of looking at it. So we looked at Mark chapter 5. Now I want to look at basically some random passages in the New Testament about demons and see how they match up to the Mark 5 passage. And then from there, expand into the intertestamental literature, which, if you've noticed, I sort of do that with every topic because I want to find out what those Jewish writers are thinking, not so much to gain knowledge. And I know a lot of you out there, I probably drive you nuts because I'll mention something from an intertestamental book and they're saying, yeah, that's where I get my information. And I say, well, that's not where I get my information. I just want to find out what they're thinking. But as a historian, and I'm sure I got my flaws, but as a historian, my goal is to look at a text and then evaluate it from a critical standpoint for its historical value, cultural value, language value, etc., to see whether or not it matches up to what I'm looking at. As a believer, I take the scripture as authoritative, okay? And I do not take the intertestamental text that we're looking for, and even post-Christian texts, as authoritative, but extremely useful to help me understand the biblical text. This is why it's the Buried Bible podcast, not the Buried Intertestamental Jewish Literature podcast. I suppose somebody could do one of those, but not me. And so, and by the way, one of my helpers in looking at the material in the New Testament comes from, well, a pretty obscure article, I must admit, but I liked it. I didn't get any opinions from Keegan yet, so it must be okay because I sent him this one too. It was written in 1980 in an evangelical Anglican journal, which of course, who gets that? Maybe Anglicans, and maybe just evangelical Anglicans. Written in 1980, it was volume 94, so it was already almost 100 years old back then, by James Dunn, who just passed away a few years ago, but he was really one of the most stalwart biblical scholars, mostly Old Testament. He had wrote a tremendous, probably the best commentary I know of on the book of Daniel. And a guy, Graham Twelftree, who was, I think he did his PhD work on demonology. And so the two of them together, either really came together to share a brain. Maybe they were of one mind, or maybe of one lip. That's a private joke. Not that private, evidently, I guess. But anyway, so they wrote a book, an article simply called Demon Possession and Exorcism in the New Testament. That's pretty cool. And I thought it was a really, really nice way to look at things. And so it gave me structure to talk about this stuff. We looked at Mark chapter 5, and of course, this is the one about Jesus exorcising a legion, or a legion of demons out of a man or men. If you read the Matthew text, Matthew, of course, who sees double occasionally, and then going into swine, and one of the reasons for that is that that they would be a host. And of course, these swine did not do what normal swine do. They jumped into the water, which I'm going to guess was probably the last place the demons wanted to go. But Mark, I think, makes it, he's very implicit. So is this Jesus making the pigs jump off a cliff? Mark won't give you a hint that that's the case, but maybe the reader is probably thinking, yeah, it serves them right. They're going into the water, which we find out later that demons don't like water. Who knew? So I want to just look at a couple of the passages, mostly Markan, by the way. Mark seems to, you think about the book of Mark, it starts off very quickly with John the Baptist. Next thing you know, he baptizes Jesus, and then immediately Jesus is now into the temptation scenario with the accuser, with the Satan. And then the next thing is him going into a synagogue in Capernaum and exorcising a demon. So in a sense, this is the announcement. He got baptized. That means God is smiling upon him, and his ministry, he's announcing his ministry is that if you're announcing that the kingdom of God among you, the kingdom of God is among you, you've got to get rid of the enemy, because you're in enemy territory. Again, I think I mentioned it before, but that'd be like somebody, in the middle of Nazi Germany saying, all right, the Allies are coming, and I'm on their side, and they're going to be here any minute, and they're going to win. And you're thinking that would be pretty devastating. And of course, exactly, Jesus in enemy territory is talking about the fact that God's going to reclaim it. And what's the proof of it? I'm getting rid of those demons, one at a time, or maybe 6,000 at a time, or 2,000. So Mark 1:20. Mark 1:21. They went to Capernaum, and this, of course, is after Jesus started seemingly randomly picking his disciples. Of course, it's not any more random than when God picked Abraham, but we're not told anything about the randomness. And immediately, which, by the way, that's Mark's, I think it's his favorite word, immediately. On the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and began, and to teach. They were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. In other words, if I'm a scribe, I got to tell you where I got all my, where all my citations are. I can't tell you anything until if I mention a Talmudic text or this or that. And of course, that's what I expect in the classroom. You have to give me your sources. But Jesus, of course, would simply talk to them without referencing, any particular rabbi. Verse 23, just then there was a man, there again, I don't know if it's the same word in Greek immediately or not, but it looks like it. There was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, which is sort of interesting. So that means you can have demonic activity in a house of study and prayer. That's pretty scary. And he cried out, saying, what business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? And it's interesting. That's a slightly different title than the one that the demon used for Jesus remember in Mark chapter 5, it was Jesus, Son of the Most High God, which is really sort of a title for God when they're talking with Gentiles. Here, this is rather specific. Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And of course, he's probably not making a confession of faith. He's probably doing it because he thinks he can have some control over Jesus, or at least domesticate him. But alas, he can't, or maybe for us. And Jesus rebuked him, saying, be quiet and come out of him. Throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. And of course, it's interesting that we have these two words, which I'm going to hint at you, is that we got the word demon and we have the word unclean spirit. They're two distinct words, but they're talking about the same spirit being. So how does that work? A bit of a spoiler alert, the term demon is the generic word that is used in the Greek world for a lower level spirit being, sometimes malevolent, sometimes benevolent. In the New Testament, the only good demon is a bad. In other words, there are no good demons; they're all bad demons. If I can ruin a phrase, unclean spirit is something different, by the way, but the audience knows what they are, and that's what we have to try to find out. Where does this unclean spirit term come from? And of course, the fact that he's thrown into convulsions, that's sort of the proof that the demon is going to leave the human host. So there's the evidence of it for the audience, and then of course for the reader here. And of course immediately the news spread all around the District of Galilee. That's a pretty big deal because we're going to find out soon that there are some Jewish exorcists, but not a lot of them that are evidently successful. And so this is the problem that we have. Then we go to, let me just stay in Mark for a little bit here. And where was the next one I was going to look at in Mark? Oh yeah, Mark chapter 6 for a minute. Just to show you that the terms are interchangeable. In Mark chapter 6, this is not an incident, but in Mark 6 verse 7, this is when he summons the 12 and then he's going to send them out. He said he summoned the 12 and began to send them out in pairs and gave them authority over unclean spirits. And then in verse 13, and they were casting out many demons and were anointing with oil many sick people and healing them. You're thinking, well, what were they, like casting out unclean spirits over here and demons over here? No, it's clearly the same situation, but there's two different words, and they are nuanced, as I think we're going to find out. I referenced this text a little while ago in Mark chapter 7, verse 24, and this is a passage I talk about in my course on women in the ancient world because of the dialogue that Jesus has with women. So here's Jesus once again back up in Gentile territory. Verse 24, Jesus got up and went away from there. Wherever he was. It's really not relevant to Mark. And he went to the region of Tyre, which is, of course, the great island off the coast of today Lebanon, but it's Phoenicia. And there he had, and when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. I'm guessing it's for R&R. In other words, I'm going into Gentile territory. They probably don't know me very well here, although I just did something in inland Decapolis area. They probably don't know me over here in Tyre yet. But after hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Again, there's that word immediately, and evidently the daughter isn't with her. Now, the woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race. By the way, if you look at the Matthew passage about this in Matthew 15, I don't remember the exact verse, she's called a Canaanite, and she's called if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if the word was Greek there or here. I think here it's, and Syrophoenician and Canaanite are the same. It's the same situation except it's point of view. If you're writing to a Jewish or / Hebrew audience, you call them Canaanite because that's the traditional term for them. If you're talking to a contemporary audience that's Gentile, you'll call them a Syrophoenician because that's what the land was called in the present day. So that's what's going on here. And of course, interesting. In 26, she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. I'm going to guess the demon and the unclean spirit that was just brought up in the verse or two before are the same. I think biblical writers they're not superfluous in their wordage. And so there's probably a reason why they've switched the words. But again, are all demons unclean spirits? I'm not sure. Are all unclean spirits demons? Not sure about that either, by the way. But evidently, if you have one of those diagrams, these two circles intersect at some point, if I can say that much. That was brilliant. By the way, I did not like math once the numbers started turning into letters and diagrams and all that other stuff. I explained that, I think, in the first podcast way back. Now, he has a dialogue with her that doesn't look particularly nice at first blush, but you got to realize this probably one of the first times Gentiles are coming to him, and he's basically saying, I'm for the lost house of Israel. I'm not ready to. It's not time to go out here yet, or something. I don't know what's going on, but of course, Mark wants to make it clear that the Gentiles are going to be open to all this, which is scandalous. You think how tough it was through the early New Testament for the Jewish readers to realize, oh yeah, the Gentiles are going to partake in this too. I think if you read Acts 15 and other places, the Gentiles get to keep their Gentileness, at least except for the parts that are so overwhelmingly an abomination that they have to get rid of them. And that's the whole purpose of the Acts 15 passage. And how does he get rid of the unclean spirit in this particular passage? Verse 29, because of this answer, because of the woman's faith, he said, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. So this is, from a distance. So this is distance exorcism. And I don't recall ever reading about somebody who does a distance exorcism. Sounds like it would be pretty intense to be able to do that. It's hard enough to do one close by. And of course, who could do that? I think what Mark is implying is that you have a divine being here. In fact, it's the Son of God himself that's doing this. And then, of course, she goes home and the demon had left. Okay. And one more in Mark to worry about is in Mark chapter 9, beginning maybe around, I suppose. Verse 9:14, he's discussing things with the disciples. Immediately a big crowd came up to him. And they're talking, and then somebody in the crowd, verse 17, answered him and said, hey, teacher, I brought you my son possessed with a spirit. Doesn't say unclean or clean, or demon or whatever, a spirit, which makes him mute, interestingly enough. Evidently, we're going to find out from intertestamental literature and even post Testament literature that demons evidently come in all shapes and sizes. And I think I said this before. It's my guess that the angelic world is probably as diverse as the earth, the natural world. And we try to prevent him. Oh, I'm sorry. Switch columns. Excuse me. And whenever it sees, verse 18, whenever it seizes him, it slams him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and stiffens out. I told your disciples to cast it out. They couldn't do it. Jesus describes the fact that this is an unbelieving generation. They brought the boy to him in verse 20. When he saw him, immediately the spirit threw him into convulsion, and falling to the ground, he began rolling around, foaming at the mouth. And he asked the father, how long has this been happening? From childhood. Every time he deals with a demonic activity or disease, his response is, the theme of his response is always the same, but the details are always different, which is really different than the exorcists, for example, in Mesopotamia, which you got to follow the same formula every time. If you do anything different, it's not going to work. And so for Jesus, to me, it's kind of like when God talks to Moses in Exodus 3, and here's my frivolous paraphrase. Moses is complaining to God, they're not going to believe me. And what does God say? So what do you got in your hand? Oh, it's a stick. All right, we're going to use the stick. And and we'll use your hand too. If he would have had a rock, maybe that would have been the rock rather than a stick, or maybe a dirt or a twig or whatever. God was going to use whatever was at hand, because he doesn't need to use the acceptable implements of exorcism or magic or what have you. That's why I call what the Israelite understanding of things would be imitative magic rather than magic, because it comes from God, the eternal creator. So anyway, and then the fellow describes, verse 22, it has often thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us. And then Jesus has the discussion with the man about his faith or unbelief. And then verse 25, when Jesus saw a crowd was rapidly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying, you deaf and mute spirit, I command you to come out of him and do not enter him again. And then what happens? The evidence is convulsions and throwing him into terrible convulsions. And it came out, and the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said he is dead. But then Jesus took him by the hand and raised him and he got up. And then there's discussion about, why they couldn't do it. And Jesus said, again, how would you know this? Verse 29, this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer. And he's not reading a manual right now. And so how does he know that? Because he knows it. I don't know about you, but if that were the answer and I was one of the disciples, I would have had the same response they did. I don't think I'm going to say another word right now. That's pretty intense. So what are we learning from Mark? Well, we learn a lot about Jesus, is that he doesn't need to conform to any particular type of exorcistic ritual. He can simply decide to do something. And it's the same thing with medicine, by the way. And of course, medical problems and demonic problems often overlap, but they're not necessarily identical. Okay, and so it would be wrong for you to say, well, in the New Testament world, all medical issues were considered demonic, but today we all consider them medical. That's just not going to fly. If you do a serious reading of the text, it just doesn't work that way. You are confronted with the fact that Mark and the others absolutely believe in a real spiritual world that is dark and evil. And I guess if you believe that God is transcendent, if you believe in the resurrection, I suppose believing in relatively speaking superfluous details like this doesn't seem to be that big of a stretch. I don't know about anybody else. So, a few more things from the New Testament I just want to go into. By the way, Mark, Luke piggybacks on most of what happens in Matthew and Mark. John, I think I mentioned this last time, hardly says anything about demonic activity. And remember, he's well over a generation later with a different, I suppose it's a mature perspective on things, looking back on the last 30 years. What do I see? What do I find that's important? Jesus has conquered the world. He's overcome the world. And so for whatever reason, he didn't consider it in his interest to write about the demonic activity, but the other gospel writers who are closer in time are doing it. In Matthew, chapter 12, just one or two anecdotal statements. Verse 27, Jesus has been accused of being an exorcist, but in a bad way, that he's in league with Satan. So he says, if I by Beelzebub, which of course is a nickname, to cast out demons, by whom do your sons cast them out? In other words, am I the only one who casts demons out? No. For this reason, they will be your judges. But if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. And that's the whole purpose. And then an anecdotal note in 43. He's talking again about prophecy and judgment. And he's talking about verse 43. Now, when the unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places seeking rest and doesn't find it. Well, the anecdote there, of course, it wasn't the purpose of the passage, is that for some reason the demons don't like a watery host. And I think the implication might be that that's the netherworld. They want to stay out of there. That's the deep. That's where that's where they're going to be tormented, and that's where they're judged. They want to stay away from that place. It's like going back to jail. That's the guess. And again, we do have some demonology in some of the intertestamental texts. All right, so with this, maybe two more, and then if you have any comments, we can go there. There is one really interesting rabbinical text. So this is probably, the text itself is a couple centuries later, but it's in the Talmud, and I thought I would bring this because it's a really nice resource. I talked about the readings from the ancient Near East, Old Testament world, done by Baker, Bill Arnold, and this is by Walter Elwell and others for the first century world. And so this is a really nice context for the New Testament. And text number 232 is Jesus as Sorcerer. And here's an excerpt from the Babylonian Talmud. And the precise reference is Sanhedrin 43a. And it's become very famous, or maybe you could say infamous. But, as a historian, if I was a skeptic about Jesus and whether he existed or not, I think this passage would be pretty powerful for me, because here are detractors of Jesus, kind of like the Roman audience, but this is a Jewish audience, basically making the argument for his existence by trashing him. In other words, you can't trash a fantasy. You have to trash someone who actually exists. And so, what do they say about Jesus? It's been taught on the eve of Passover, Yesu was hanged. Now, you think about that. That's not technically wrong. I mean, he was hung up on a tree. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy." Now, of course, the New Testament writers don't give you 40 days, but of course, that's the tradition that you would, even later on in medieval period, you've got you got to spend 40 days before you make a pronouncement on people. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward in his behavior, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. And then it says, our rabbis taught Yesu had 5 disciples. Mata, that's probably Matthew. Nakai, that some have argued maybe it's Nicodemus, I don't know. Nezer, maybe just Nazarene somebody. Booney, I don't know who Booney was. I know he's probably out in the boonies somewhere. And then Toda, which one commentator says maybe it's Thaddeus. We don't know. And there's probably an allusion to something like this. If you think about it, in going back to Mark for a minute, in Mark chapter 3, verse 22, when Jesus, Mark 3, verse 20, he came home and the crowd gathered again to such an extent that they could not even eat a meal. When his own people heard of this, they went out to take custody of him, for they were saying he's nuts. I'm paraphrasing. You think about it. You know who his own people were? Probably his family, including probably one of his kid brother, James, I'm guessing, and Joseph and the like. And so remember, they, this is Jesus, our older brother. So I got, this has been traditionally assumed that it's his family talking to him. And then verse 22, the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he is possessed by Beelzebul, and he casts out demons by the ruler of demons. And of course, that's the implication of him being called an exorcist, is that he's an evil exorcist and led people to apostasy. How do you know somebody's an exorcist and they're bad? Because they get bad results. And so that's what they're saying about Jesus. And there actually is an ancient pagan commentator who says similar things about Jesus, and his name is Celsus. Good thing about the bad news for Celsus, his works didn't survive. Bummer. Good news for us, excerpts of Celsus were put in Origen's, the great early church father from the late 2nd century. He excerpts Celsus, who was probably his contemporary, it looks like. Celsus was a Greek philosopher. And by the way, it appears that during Celsus' time, Christianity had reached enough of, it was on everybody's radar now, because it probably was, by the end of the 2nd century, it's big enough to make people notice. And now philosophers are noticing, and they're probably thinking, this is really an irrational, there's something not right about this. And by the way, if you're out there and you're a skeptic, I would say, why don't you go and look up ancient skepticism and the skepticism about Christianity. You are rehearsing pretty much the same stuff over and over again. It's been recycled for 2 millennia. By the way, there's nothing new that hasn't already been argued in the past. So I'm going to get there. So Origen wrote a whole book against Celsus. Bummer for Celsus. Again, he's only known by the bad book review. And so what does Origen do? He's giving us excerpts of a writer whose writings don't exist any longer. That's the word non-extant. And he quotes Celsus talking about Jesus being an exorcist. But it's really interesting, his reasoning. This is in book 1, section 6 of Origen's against Celsus. Remember, Celsus is the Greek philosopher, Origen's the Christian writer, if you're mixed. He says, it is by the names of certain demons and by the use of incantations that the Christians appear to be possessed of power, and the implication is miraculous power. It was by means of sorcery that he, meaning Jesus, was able to accomplish the wonders which he performed, and that foreseeing that others would attain the same knowledge and do the same things, making a boast of doing them by the help of the power of God, he excludes such from his kingdom. In other words, he was exercising, and then he excludes the things that he's exercising from the kingdom. And he doesn't like sorcerers either. Okay, but if the sorcerers are justly excluded, while himself is guilty of the same practices, he's wicked. But if he isn't guilty of wickedness in doing such things, neither are they. And so, in other words, what Celsus was doing, he was lumping. In other words, Jesus is doing the same thing that sorcerer is doing. Why is he so upset about it? They're doing the exorcist are, if they're doing it, who cares? I mean, in other words, for Origen, I don't care who you're calling attention to, whether you're using magical forces or you're claiming it's God. It's all the same thing. So what's Jesus bothered about? Why is he upset with sorcerers who are doing it? Because, of course, he doesn't understand true monotheism. Jesus is doing it by the power of God. It might look similar, but of course, that's the whole nature of everything about ancient Israel that I've been talking about till I'm blue in the face for the last 30 podcasts, is that Israel looked like the nations on a superficial level, but when you scratch the surface, they were complete and polar opposites with the nations and how they operated. So here's Celsus really misunderstanding that. And in fact, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If Jesus was doing just like they were, why is he upset with them? And so he's wicked if he's arguing against them. And if they're okay, well, then he should be okay too. It's sort of interesting logic if you accept this premise, and of course I don't. But I thought that was very telling. And like I said, as a historian, that would be one of my arguments for the historicity, at least the bare bones historicity of the Jesus tradition. All right. I'll take a breather for a minute. If you have any thoughts, or if you want me to continue on, I will, whatever you're...
Yeah, so I'd say I do have questions, but do you have any other specific passages you want to unpack first? Otherwise, I mean, I do have a question about Luke again, which is just the part after I think you mentioned. So maybe I'll let you finish up your passages, and then we'll dive into questions.
All right. Just a couple more brief ones. Maybe we'll go to the book of Acts for just a minute and look one. I'm not trying to be exhaustive. I probably should say that every time. If I was trying to be exhaustive, we probably would be in episode 60 and you'd be bored to tears if you're not already. So Acts chapter 5, verse 16, this is clearly Luke. By the way, if you don't think Luke wrote Acts, then Luke didn't write Luke. And so whoever it was that wrote those two books was probably somebody else named Luke. So sort of a joke, but by the way, that's what they say about the Homeric question. Homer, the argument was that there must have been multiple sources for the Homer, Iliad, and Odyssey. And so somebody jokingly said Homer was not written by Homer, but by another man of the same name. But anyway, you could say that like about Moses. Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, but it was somebody else named Moshe or whatever. All right, so I'm beating a dead horse now. All right, great. Acts 5:16. Also, people from the cities in the vicinity of Jerusalem were coming together, bringing people who were sick or afflicted with unclean spirits, and they were all being healed. Okay, and that's again mixing the natural and the supernatural. I would say probably pretty indiscriminately. Chapter 8, verse 7. In the case of many who had unclean spirits, they were coming out of them shouting with a loud voice, and many who had been paralyzed and lame were healed, again mixing the natural and the supernatural. By the way, we like to separate them because that's what we do in the modern Western world. We've done that for about the last 3+ centuries, and so we sort of can't help it. But in the ancients, they did know the difference, but it didn't bother them to mix them together like that. Then maybe in Acts 16, verse 16 and following, here's, of course, Paul's the main topic, really, in Acts, the second half of the book. It happened that as we were going to the place of prayer, a slave girl having a spirit of divination. Now, what does that mean? It it you could think it's a figure of speech, but when you look at the word spirit, it means spirit. That it's some sort of heavenly force, I suppose, that is taken her. And she met us, and who was bringing her master as much profit by fortune telling. Following after Paul and us, she kept crying out, "These men are the bondservants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation." Sounds good, but bad source, and it's probably calling them out. She continually did this for many days, but Paul was greatly annoyed. Yeah, I guess. And by the way, annoy in Greek is literally the term nous is the word for mind, and the in the beginning is the negative. And so if you annoy me, it's because you forgot to bring your brain today or something. That's literally what it means. I suppose it's a nuance of a change, but so. But Paul turned and said, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her," and it came out of that at that very moment. Now there are a few other places of sorcery, and then Paul mentions a couple passages that I think are relevant in this context, and I'm going to be sort of want to actually explain them at this point. But in 1 Corinthians 10, and this actually sort of throws a spoke into our wheels here. In when 1 Corinthians, Paul is responding to comments that are making. I don't think the Corinthians are asking Paul questions. I think they're making statements, sort of questioning his authority. They certainly do that in the 2 Corinthians. So 10:21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Verse 20, sorry. Now, but I say to the things which are Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons. And of course, they're sacrificing which they think are gods, but they're actually demonic, is what Paul is saying. And by the way, even then, he's not giving you a dissertation on demonology at that point, because the term, again, in Greek is a catch-all phrase for a heavenly being, usually of the lower class, I suppose you could say. And so, what Paul has done is that, and if this was taken by the early churches, he's basically saying, all the gods of the nations are demonic. And of course, the church did run with that, and that became, a significant tradition. And then another isolated statement in 1 Timothy 4, verse 1. Let me make sure I got the right one. Maybe I should be in 1 Timothy and not 2 Timothy. What do you think here? Yeah. But the Spirit, which of course is God's Spirit, and he's almost also making, it's sort of a pun here, but the Spirit explicitly says that in the latter times, some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to the deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons. Okay, what's a doctrine of demon? It's the traditions, that are outside of the sphere of true religion. And if you really want to look at a book that is centered around about anti-demonology, that's the book of Ephesians, in my opinion. Principalities and powers and all those things, those are spiritual beings that are malevolent, in my opinion. And since Paul is at Ephesus, which is the center of magic in the ancient world, these people who he's talking to have probably just come out of demonic magic traditions, and Paul's telling them, hey, Jesus is higher than all of them. You've got something more powerful than all the demonic activity and magic activity in the entire world, especially even from ground zero where we are here. If what did we used to call Las Vegas when I was a kid? Sin City. This, the epicenter of the universe was Sin City. And so, where were there more churches per capita in the U.S. In the early days? Sin City. You know, to try to counteract it, I suppose. But the point is that here's Paul right in the nerve center of the ancient magic world with demonology and all that, and he's announcing to them. And so you really want to know about demonology, you read Ephesians 1-3, and I already mentioned, I think, the book by Clinton Arnold. By the way, anything by Clint Arnold on Ephesians is going to be a masterpiece about demonology. So we'll just go from there. So it's not exhaustive, but that's my discussion of at least trying to understand, demons / unclean spirits. And I think like I said, we can sort of gather a few generic statements, but the writer assumes you know all about demonology. And it's because of, I think, what's being discussed in the intertestamental period, which, like I said, I don't think it's authoritative, but it doesn't mean it's not informational in terms of helping me understand the New Testament context. So.
Yeah. Well, I definitely do have questions. I'll try not to jump too far ahead, but then maybe if I ask a question that is going to be discussed on the next one, it's at least good in terms of preparatory work, of kind of getting our brains and minds going, thinking on these things, and we'll look at it more when we get to the intertestamental period writings. But my first question, and I mean, I get you've talked about it a little bit, but what are some of the specifics of where they don't overlap, the unclean spirit and the demon?
If I'm just using the New Testament, I don't think I could figure it out. So I'm not. So in other words, I need the intertestamental period to help me with that.
Yeah, because we lump them in, because I feel like we typically lump them in together, but it seems pretty clear and evident. Like they're using two different terms. Sometimes they're interchangeable, but they're different terms.
Well, I think yes, I don't know. To me, it's kind of like poetry when you're writing. Yeah, I wish I could think of something right now, but I know I can't, and I'm not quick on my feet. But the point is, what do you do in poetry if you want to talk about the same thing? Maybe it would be like saying, I'm writing a poem about an automobile, and then I use the word automobile in the first stanza, and then I use the word car in the next stanza. Well, obviously they're the same thing, but if you think about it, what is one emphasizing? If I use the term car, I'm talking about the compartment itself. I know this is really brilliant.
Romantic.
I'm talking about the compartment itself. And when I talk about automobile, I'm talking about the self-propelled. In other words, what makes an automobile a unique type of car? It's because it's self-propelled. Okay. Auto,
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That's brilliant. What I'm saying is that when I use the word demon, unclean spirit, it's often the same thing, but it's emphasizing something different about the being.
I actually do think that's helpful.
Wow.
No, I do, because then if you're going to look at it from like like they are the same thing, but yet not the same thing.
Yeah.
Which is weird. But it's kind of like you could have used van, because when you think car, but it could have been. So like a van is an automobile, but a van's not a car. So it's like there's subtleties in there.
Or a car could be something that you have on a train or pulled by a horse. What do you think they were called? Horseless carriages, So in other words, a car is a compartment used for transport. Okay. And then at some point it was attached onto the automobile type of transport. I'm really.
Now you're getting really geeky on us.
Now I'm going to have to make up a poem about automobiles. Like, for example, in Italian, the word for car is macchina. Okay. They just call it the machine. Okay. And that's the nickname for it. But if you use the ancient, the Greek word, it probably would be understood, but they'd probably make fun of you, like they always would when I tried my Italian out. All right. So
my next question would be, based on what we've looked at, calling out Jesus's name, because I think I think for modern readers, I think we, even if we don't maybe think about it, I think we kind of lump it in with the verse that's, well, even the demons believe, or even the demons shudder, but they're clearly not saved. And so I think what do you want with us, Jesus, Son of the Most High? Almost as if it's like them scared and trembling, but from your perspective, does it have more to do with the subduing by using a name?
Oh, it's probably both. I mean, think about it. They're, because, what do they say at some point? I forgot now the passage, but, where like, our time isn't yet, or something that Jesus, they say to Jesus, like, I know we're being judged, but this isn't the right time, is it? I mean, I didn't get the memo that you're doing it right now. And so, but the point is, I call out your name in order to get some sort of domination over you, even if it's just temporary. And so I know who you are. You're the Holy One of God, so and so. And so, suppose evidently that's types of, maybe that is supposed to subdue you. Um, kind of like in the cartoon Bluey, what do the kids do to stop their parents? If they're holding a feather, you just say the word heavy and you're supposed to drop everything. That was deep, wasn't it? Shows you I'm a real grandparent. But in other words, but in a sense, it's almost as if you're casting a spell on the person. And think about Jesus. Sometimes he asks them their name, and sometimes he doesn't. You know why? Because he could. In other words, it doesn't matter to him if he wants them out. He does it from a distance. He does it, without. Every time he does it, he does something different to show that he's not. He doesn't need to conform to the, exorcistic principles or magic, principles of magic. And so in other words, they're confessing. It's ironic. They're confessing what's true about him, but that's not why they're doing it. They're doing it to try to gain control over him. And so in James 2:19, when it talks about the fact that demons believe, well, there clearly it's intellectual assent. Yeah, well, they know exactly who that guy is, but they haven't. They're not putting their loyalty in him, and evidently it wouldn't matter at that point.
Yeah, which is a big slap. That verse is good for you. You say you believe. Well, the demons believe, and they might even do more than you. At least they shudder. Right. So there is a bit of that.
Yes.
Like fear of, well, we do know who's coming.
Oh yeah, sure. And that's and if they find out that they're not successful, in other words, trying to put domination over the divine being of divine beings doesn't seem to work very well. Because he transcends all of existence, and so you can't use your natural and supernatural forces over the creator being. If you think about it, it's rather silly. Think about it. Here I am. I'm the creator of all these Lego pieces, and they come to life, and one of them wants to try to put a spell on me. Wait a minute. I'm out here. You can't do anything to me. Wow, that was brilliant. That was even worse than my automobile car comparison.
You're just on a roll with the analogies today.
And Bluey, yeah.
No, that does make sense. But do you think there's any, in terms of them calling Jesus out, is there any of that, but it's not Jesus's time either. So some of that's backhanded by what they're saying. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, kind of like when Jesus's mom's like, all right, we need some wine. And he's like, not yet. Like, it's not time for me yet. And then he does it. Is there any of that? Because that would be different it wouldn't work for Mark 5 because it appears that it's just Jesus and maybe a couple of his disciples. It's not like some big crowds around when he's being called out.
Well, there's a lot of demons around.
Well, they're all right
and
there.
a bunch of pigs. But that one about Jesus and his mother, to me, I think that's almost comic relief, because you think about how they interact. It's like nonverbal communication. Like, I mean, because Mom, it's not my time yet. And so what does she say? Just do what he tells you to do. Like she doesn't even answer, doesn't respond. And of course, if you and I know each other so well, quite often I'll just give you a look or, or whatever, just like our spouse might. Like, I don't have to tell you anything. You know what I'm thinking. You know what I want you to do. Um, and what is his complaint? What would you call it? Maybe a mild complaint, like, like, I need you to go take out the trash. Oh, Dad, do I have to? Why would I respond to that? I know I don't want to cause Scripture to descend to that level, but that's the type of thing that's going on there. And so, what does he mean by my time is not yet? I'm not supposed to be made public yet. Well, but he did it anyway. What does that mean? I don't know.
So what do the demons mean by it's not their time yet? Or is it just simply what we gather from Revelation later? That there's going to be a time, but they're like, well, no, right now is our time you're supposed to let us do what we want.
And how do they know that? Well, actually, you read some of the Jewish writings like Book of Jubilees, they'll actually opine on that and try to figure out, how would the demons know this or that? And actually, they do know their theology. And in fact, it sort of behooves them to know their theology. We've got a certain level of time before, this ends, and so we better make hay, while we have it. And so they evidently knew. And so the writer of Jubilees, the Testament of Solomon, and of course, First Enoch, to mention three, they make rational religious commentary on some of these questions. And so they're answering questions that inquiring minds have, and sometimes they do a really good job of it. It doesn't mean they're authoritative.
Next question would be, and I think it probably gets taken to the extreme, but there are certain times where then, like you already mentioned it, where Jesus calls them out by name. Is there significance in that, or is it all still in the same sphere of I find out your name? No, actually, I'm in charge, because he doesn't do it all the time. But then now in modern church, when people are trying to it gets wonky and weird. Well, no, you got to find out its name and you got to do this, and it's almost like they almost reverse kind of like the theological messaging that Jesus is showing is like, y'all got your exorcism stuff. I don't need any of it. Like, okay, if I wanted to, I snap get out. And now we've like almost resorted back of like, we have to follow people that get wonky and weird with this stuff, which these things and exorcisms can obviously go rogue, but there's a big stress on you have to like find out the name first. But there's certain instances where we see Jesus ask and find out the name before casting out.
And my answer first of all, I'm not going to say a lot about that because that's sort of entering into contemporary Christianity, which is definitely not my forte. The closer we get to the present, the less information I have. But I sort of do live in the present, so I guess I can say something.
Sort of.
And I would say that if you look at how Jesus operates and his disciples operate, now, of course, the disciples are, what would you say, conduits? In other words, the power has been given to them, okay? Jesus is the power, okay? So that's why he doesn't need anybody's authority. They, of course, are doing it on behalf of him. And so they can say, by Jesus, I command you to come out, etc. And of course, if they don't have his authority, it doesn't work very well. And we see that in the book of Acts in one place. But to make formulas for doing it, you're right. I think that goes against the whole principle. It makes it look as if it's pagan exorcism again.
Yeah.
Right? No, you got to have this established formula. You have to do it this way or that way. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, you can't manufacture this. God, to me, it's kind of like modern prophecy. If you look at prophecy, it's never authority. Even in 1 Corinthians, what is prophecy? It's for edification. And so how do I know I'm being prophetic? I probably don't know. God will use someone and then he decides. In other words, I don't think it's a permanent gift myself. It's whatever God wants to use. And you often don't even know that you are speaking for God when you say such and such. And I don't think it's authoritative. Here, in terms of exorcism, I guess the proof will be in the pudding. Did it work? But
is that just our modern minds messing up the fact that we always read these details?
yes,
And sometimes we see a detail about something and we want to know the reason for it. And it's like, oh, they're giving us this logistical roadmap. And it's like, no, they're describing. They're not prescribing.
just like the book of Acts. Does everything in the book of Acts, are we supposed to do it that way? No, it's for a very particular context. And if you're wooden about it, I'm going to be like Paul and Barnabas and get angry at each other and split. Go down and do likewise. I mean, the book of Acts has events that happen, and they are very particular to the first century. They are there to encourage us. Does it mean that I'm supposed to model my church on them? In principle, yes. In specifics, maybe yes, maybe no, depending on the circumstance.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because otherwise, because if we take everything as a prescription, that like the Bible's prescribing it, then it's like, well then I guess the Bible authors can't describe any event.
Exactly right.
Like if I were to describe like my salvation event, now it worked out, so I'd be like, here's what happened and it worked out. Oh, so then I just do that. It's like, well, no, I'm very blessed that God's gracious. I don't think ultimatums are a great way to work with God. You know what I mean? Like, but I wasn't a Christian yet. So the way I prayed and talked to God and it worked out, but then if somebody comes and prescribes it, oh, no, you demand. It's like, well, I'm just describing, like, praise God that he is gracious and merciful to me. But I wouldn't say I think you should go and do likewise.
Yeah, because I'm guessing afterwards, as you matured, you probably would have said, I think I'm a little sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. I didn't realize you actually were the king of the universe.
Exactly.
It's like, and so
that's another story for another day. I don't want to make
light of that, but the point is, you're right. Every situation is different, and it's different when Jesus operates in exorcisms or healings. Every time he does it differently, and it probably, to me, it's kind of like wisdom in interacting with someone. I might interact with you. I notice that you're forlorn and hurting. Oh, I interact one way. Oh, I notice that you're really raging angry. I think I'm going to back off right now. In other words, I have to use wisdom to determine that. And you think about it, whenever Jesus answers a question that somebody has, he usually seems to not answer the direct question, but he's answering the question that's behind it, that only God would know. How, you ask me, I'm not really sure that, the Bible is true. And
this is a made up scenario.
Yes. But you know what I'm saying is that, so how would, I have to ask you a bunch of questions to find out, actually, I don't think that's the question you have. I think the question is, why did the nuns beat me when I was a kid, wrap my knuckles or something? Sorry, I'm just making this up. But the point is that I have to ask these questions to find out, there's a question behind, I was abandoned when I was 4 years old. Oh, so that's what your real question is. Let's deal with that one. And that's, of course, what Jesus does throughout. So, the rich young ruler, what does he tell him to do? Go sell everything you have. That's probably specific for him, because I'm guessing that Jesus is not saying that to everybody. If everybody sold what they have, well, anyway, but what I'm saying is that it's very specific. And so when he, at each point, each circumstance has the same end result, but the mode is always different. And it's random to the reader. It's random, and it basically is a thumb in the eye to the exorcists who have to perform these rituals. That's why Naaman in 2 Kings 5, he goes all the way down to Elisha to get his leprosy cured, and Elisha doesn't even come out of his house, and he goes and he just tells his servant, just go tell him to take a bath, and Naaman is furious. He says, wait a minute. I came all the way down here and you told me to take a bath. Why aren't you doing a waving ceremony and doing all these rituals? And, and his servant says, well, probably wouldn't be hard to take a bath. Just go take a bath. But the point is that you're not doing, you're not, I suppose to be like, I need a new password. What's my new password? And your answer is, why don't you use the word password? Nobody will figure that one out.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm spent.
No, I think that's good. And, but yeah, I think that just speaks to Jesus and the fact of him, his all-knowingness. He knows us each intimately. And I think that's beautiful. Like Rich Young Ruler, other people, he's working at the heart issue of each individual person, which was we always can find a rabbit trail. So that's fun. So I have a couple other ones. I think I'll just do one, unless this is what we're going to discuss, and that would be a good part of the next one, which would be, I do want to talk about the dry places and their like abode, and why do they have to have a host, or is that going to be, will that be pretty applicable on the next one?
It's applicable on the next one only because intertestamental literature occasionally talks about that, but you're going to love this because I say it every time. It's never the main topic, but it's an anecdotal piece. And so if you're triggering, why don't demons like water? Well, we're never told, but we can sort of gather it by piece A, piece B, piece C, and piece D, none of which go together, but we mix them all together. We can
make dust.
That. But that's of course how I do Mesopotamian studies. Is that you want to talk about such and such a topic in Mesopotamia, you find all these texts that don't have that as the topic, but they give you an anecdotal piece of information, and you take all the anecdotes and try to create something intelligent from it. And sometimes you do, and sometimes another Assyriologist will tell you that you didn't.
Sweet. Well, we'll save it for next time then. So that'll be a little teaser. I got a couple questions on that, and obviously our big one's going to be, where do demons come from, and what is a demon? Because there's debate around that, and so we'll save that for next episode. But as always, thanks for tuning in. Feel free, drop us a comment, like, subscribe, all the fun stuff. We appreciate your support and you guys watching these episodes, and so I know we have a lot of fun making them. We hope that you enjoy and have a lot of fun also out there watching, listening, and wrestling with us. So until next time, that's the Buried Bible Podcast.
Thank you.